They laughed when he crawled across the floor of his father's boardroom, but the day he stood up, 3 continents trembled. In the heart of Lagos, where the skyline clawed at the heavens with towers of glass and steel, there stood a building that commanded more respect than any cathedral or palace, Okafor Holdings. The name alone was enough to make bankers sit straighter in their chairs, enough to make politicians return phone calls within the hour, enough to make grown men lower their voices when they spoke of the man who had built it all from nothing. Chief Emmanuel Okafor had arrived in Lagos 40 years ago, with nothing but a second-hand suitcase and a promise he had whispered to his dying mother in their village in Anambra, a promise that he would never let poverty define the Okafor name again. And he had kept that promise with a ferocity that shook the foundations of Nigerian commerce. By the time Chief Emmanuel turned 60, his empire stretched across 3 continents. Oil refineries in the Niger Delta, shipping routes that crisscrossed the Atlantic, a real estate portfolio that included high-rise towers in London, luxury apartments in Dubai, and beachfront properties in Cape Town. His corporate headquarters in Victoria Island rose 17 floors above the Lagos Lagoon. Its walls were lined with Italian marble. Its lobby gleamed with gold-rimmed chandeliers that cast soft amber light onto floors so polished you could see your reflection staring back at you, like a ghost of your lesser self. Rolls-Royces and armored Mercedes lined the private garage beneath the building, each one detailed weekly by a team flown in from Germany. Security personnel in tailored black suits stood at every entrance, their earpieces humming with encrypted frequencies. But Chief Emmanuel Okafor had everything except peace. Because Chief Emmanuel had 2 sons. And 2 sons in a house built on ambition is 1 son too many. The eldest was Obiora, tall, broad-shouldered, with a jaw that could have been carved from granite and eyes that held the cold, calculating stillness of a man who had been measuring his inheritance since the day he learned to count. Obiora had studied finance at the London School of Economics, not because he loved numbers, but because he loved what numbers could buy. He returned to Lagos with a British accent he wielded like a weapon and a hunger for control that made even the senior board members uneasy. He was his mother's son, Madame Ifeoma, Chief Emmanuel's second wife, a woman whose beauty had once stopped traffic on Broad Street, but whose heart had long since turned to something harder than the diamonds she wore on every finger. The youngest was Chukwuemeka, and Chukwuemeka was different. Where Obiora saw spreadsheets, Chukwuemeka saw people. Where Obiora memorized stock prices, Chukwuemeka memorized the names of every driver, every cleaner, every security guard who worked the night shift at Okafor Holdings. He had studied engineering at the University of Lagos, not abroad, because he had told his father he wanted to understand Nigeria from the inside, not from a window seat on a British Airways flight. He was quieter than his brother, thinner. His smile came easily, and it reached his eyes, which was something that could never be said about Obiora. Chief Emmanuel loved both his sons, but it was Chukwuemeka he trusted. It was Chukwuemeka he called into his office on quiet evenings to discuss the future of the empire. It was Chukwuemeka whose hand he held on the morning he first felt his heart stutter and skip. Little did any of them know that fate had already chosen its favorite, and its cruelty was absolute.
The accident happened on a Tuesday. A rainy Tuesday in November. The kind of rain that turns Lagos roads into rivers and rivers into graves.
Chukwuemeka was driving back from the Lekki Free Trade Zone after inspecting a new warehouse facility. His headlights cut through the downpour like 2 weak prayers. The trailer came from nowhere, a 40-foot container truck with failed brakes and a driver who had not slept in 36 hours. The impact folded Chukwuemeka's SUV like a piece of paper. Metal screamed. Glass exploded into 1,000 tiny stars, and when the paramedics finally cut him free from the wreckage 3 hours later, his spine had been shattered in 2 places. He was 22 years old. The lead surgeon, a gray-haired man with steady hands and tired eyes, told Chief Emmanuel the truth in a quiet corridor outside the operating theater. He said that the damage to the thoracic vertebrae was severe, that the spinal cord had not been fully severed but had been compressed beyond what most patients ever recover from. He said that there was, perhaps, a 5% chance that Chukwuemeka would ever walk again. 5%. But 5%, he added carefully, required years of rehabilitation. experimental procedures that were only available in South Korea or Germany, and a sum of money that most families would never be able to afford. For now, the young man would not walk. Whether that sentence was permanent or temporary, only time and God could decide. The hospital room became his world for 4 months. White walls, the smell of antiseptic so sharp it burned the inside of his nostrils. The rhythmic beeping of monitors that counted his heartbeats as if reminding him, with every pulse, that he was still alive even though half of his body had died. His legs lay beneath the thin hospital blanket like two strangers present, but no longer his. He could see them. He could not feel them. And in the silence between visiting hours, when the nurse's footsteps faded down the corridor and the fluorescent light hummed its lonely song above his bed, Chukwuemeka would stare at his legs and will them to move. He would clench his jaw until his teeth ached. He would grip the bed rails until his knuckles turned white, but nothing happened. Nothing ever happened. His father came every day. Chief Emmanuel would sit beside the bed in his three-piece agbada, his walking stick resting against the chair, and he would hold his son's hand without speaking, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for 2. The silence between them was not empty, it was full of everything they could not say. On one particular evening, when the last light of the Lagos sun bled through the hospital window like a wound, Chief Emmanuel leaned close. His voice was barely a whisper, roughened by age and by a sadness that no amount of money could cure. He said, with trembling lips, that Chukwuemeka was the heart of this empire, that the buildings and the contracts and the bank accounts meant nothing without purpose. And that purpose was what Chukwuemeka carried inside him. Not in his legs, but in his mind, in his will, in the stubborn fire that the Okafor bloodline had carried for generations. Chukwuemeka squeezed his father's hand. He could not speak, but he understood. 6 months later, Chief Emmanuel Okafor collapsed in his office. A massive stroke. He was dead before the ambulance arrived. The empire he had built with 40 years of sweat and sacrifice was now a kingdom without a king. And then the will was read. The lawyer's voice echoed through the boardroom like a verdict. 60% of all shares in Okafor Holdings were left to Chukwuemeka. 60%. The majority. The throne. Obiora sat across the mahogany table, and something behind his eyes cracked. Not visibly, not loudly, but it cracked the way a dam cracks before the flood, silently, fatally, from the inside. What followed happened with surgical precision. Within 3 weeks, Madame Ifioma produced medical documents signed by 2 doctors whose practices had recently received generous donations from an anonymous benefactor declaring that Chukwuemeka Okafor suffered from diminished cognitive capacity as a result of his spinal injury. The documents claimed he was unfit to manage his own affairs, let alone a multinational corporation. They were lies. Every word was a lie. But lies dressed in medical letterhead and legal jargon have a way of becoming truth in boardrooms where power is the only language spoken. The board voted 11-3. Chukwuemeka's shares were placed in a trust controlled by Obiora. His seat on the board was revoked. His access card was deactivated. His name was removed from the company directory. On the day they escorted him out, 2 security guards, men whose names Chukwuemeka had memorized, whose children's birthdays he had celebrated, wheeled him through the lobby in silence. The marble floor that had once reflected his father's proud footsteps now reflected the slow, humiliating rotation of rubber wheels. The gold-rimmed chandeliers cast their amber light on a young man who had lost his legs, his father, and now his legacy in the span of a single year. They gave him a transfer to Enugu, a small office, a monthly stipend that would not cover the rent on a decent apartment in Lagos, and a silence so loud it swallowed everything. Some would ask, later, why Chukwuemeka did not fight, why he did not hire a lawyer, file an injunction, drag the case before a judge, and expose the lies. The answer was simple, and it was cruel. He had no money. Every naira he had ever earned had been funneled through Okafor Holdings accounts that Obiora now controlled. His personal bank cards had been deactivated within 48 hours of the board vote.
The family lawyers, 3 firms that Chief Emmanuel had retained for decades, had all received letters from Obiora's office. The letters reminded them of their ongoing retainers. They advised, in language that was polite but unmistakable, that any engagement with Chukwuemeka Okafor would constitute a conflict of interest. The legal system in Lagos moved slowly for the rich and not at all for the powerless. And Chukwuemeka, sitting in a wheelchair, with a shattered spine and a grief so heavy it pressed the air from his lungs, was, in that moment, as powerless as any man had ever been. He did not have the strength to fight. Not yet. The fire was there, burning deep beneath the surface, but it had not yet found its way out. The glass doors of Okafor Holdings closed behind him with a sound that was neither loud nor soft. It was final. And Chukwuemeka sat in his wheelchair in the parking lot, the Lagos heat pressing down on his shoulders like a punishment, and he looked up at the building his father had built. He did not cry. But something inside him, something deeper than tears, deeper than grief, deeper than the shattered bones in his spine, began to burn. Slowly, quietly, the way fire burns underground before it erupts and swallows the entire forest. Neither Obiora nor Madame Ifeoma knew that this was only the beginning. The city of Enugu greeted Chukwuemeka the way it greeted all forgotten things, with dust, silence, and the slow indifference of a place that had seen too many broken men pass through its gates to be moved by one more. The apartment Obiora had arranged for him sat at the end of a narrow, unpaved road in the Abakpa district, wedged between a mechanic's workshop and a church whose loudspeakers crackled with prayers every morning at 5. It was a 2-room flat on the ground floor, the only practical option for a man in a wheelchair. The walls were the color of old tea stains. The ceiling fan spun with such reluctance, it seemed to be debating whether the effort was worth it. The bathroom tiles were cracked. The kitchen tap dripped with a rhythm that kept time like a metronome, counting down the seconds of a life put on pause. A single window faced the road, and through it came the sounds that would become the soundtrack of Chukwuemeka's new existence. The clanging of wrenches from the mechanic next door, the shouts of children chasing each other through puddles, the distant rumble of Okada motorcycles, carrying passengers who had somewhere to be. The monthly stipend from Okafor Holdings arrived on the 1st of each month, 150,000 naira. Barely enough to cover rent, food, and the medications his spine required to keep the nerve pain from consuming him whole. There was no driver, no cook, no assistant. For the first time in his life, Chukwuemeka Okafor had to learn how to survive as an ordinary man. And for a man who could not walk, ordinary survival was an act of war. He learned to cook from his wheelchair, positioning himself sideways at the low counter, reaching for pots that were always just slightly too far away. He burned his forearms on the edge of the gas stove more times than he could count. He learned to bathe himself by gripping the bathroom railing his landlord had reluctantly installed after Chukwuemeka offered to pay double deposit. He learned to wheel himself to the small market 3 streets away, navigating potholes and drainage ditches that could swallow his front wheels and send him pitching forward onto the red earth like a sack of groundnuts. Each trip took 45 minutes. Each trip left his arms trembling and his palms raw. But he did not stop. He could not stop. Because inside the second room of that crumbling apartment, on a desk made from a plywood board balanced on 2 stacks of cement blocks, sat the only thing that kept the fire in his chest alive. A second-hand laptop. He had bought it from a student at the University of Nigeria, Nsukka, for 25,000 naira. The screen had a crack, running diagonally from one corner to the other, and the battery died after 40 minutes without power, which meant Chukwuemeka's work schedule was dictated entirely by the erratic supply of electricity in Abakpa. When the power went out, which was often, he would sit in the darkness and think. When the power returned, sometimes at 2 in the morning, sometimes at 4, he would wheel himself to the desk and code. He was building something that had no name yet, something that lived in the space between his engineering training and his own broken body, a navigation system for autonomous vehicles that could be adapted for mobility devices, wheelchairs, prosthetics, a system that used terrain mapping algorithms to predict obstacles before they appeared, that could turn a wheelchair from a prison into a vehicle of independence. He had sketched the first designs on hospital napkins during those 4 months of recovery. Now, in this tiny room in Enugu,
With nothing but a cracked laptop and a will that refused to die, he was turning those sketches into code. Days slowly turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. As the weeks went by, Chukwuemeka settled into a rhythm of solitude and labor. He woke before dawn. He coded until his eyes burned. He wheeled himself to the market for food. He coded again until the power failed. He slept. He repeated. The world outside his window continued its noisy, indifferent business, and he continued his quiet, furious work, and neither paid much attention to the other. His only consistent human contact in those early weeks was an elderly woman named Mama Nkechi. She lived 2 doors down, in a room even smaller than his. She spent most of her days sitting on a plastic chair outside her door, watching the road with the patient stillness of a woman who had outlived most of the things she had been waiting for. She was 73 years old, with a face carved by decades of sun and sorrow, and hands that moved slowly but never without purpose. She had noticed Chukwuemeka on his first day in Abakba, noticed the wheelchair, noticed the silence, noticed the way he held his jaw tight, as if clenching it against something invisible. She did not ask questions. She did not offer advice. But when the power went out, which was often, she would send her grandchild, a small boy of about 8, with dusty knees and enormous eyes, to knock on Chukwuemeka's door with a plastic cup of water and a candle. On the nights when the generator at the mechanic's workshop next door roared to life and shook the walls, she would appear at his window and ask, in a voice that was both gentle and firm, whether he had eaten. If the answer was no, which it often was, she would return 10 minutes later with a small plate of boiled yam and palm oil. She never stayed to chat. She simply delivered the plate, nodded once, and returned to her plastic chair. It was not much, but in a city that had decided Chukwuemeka did not exist, Mama Nkechi's small, stubborn acts of care were proof that he did. It was on one particular afternoon, during the first heavy rains of April, that everything shifted. Chukwuemeka had been returning from the market with a small bag of rice balanced on his lap when his front wheel caught the edge of a gutter that the rain had turned invisible. The wheelchair tipped, the rice scattered, and Chukwuemeka found himself face down in the red mud, his arms too exhausted from the day's travel to push himself upright, the rain hammering his back like 1,000 tiny fists. He lay there for what felt like an eternity. People walked past. An Okada driver slowed, looked, and drove on. A woman selling oranges from a tray on her head glanced at him, clucked her tongue, and kept walking. Nobody stopped. In Lagos, Chukwuemeka had been an Okafor in Enugu. He was just another cripple in the mud. And then he heard footsteps. Quick, light, splashing through puddles without hesitation. 2 hands gripped his shoulders and pulled. They were small hands, but they were strong. And they did not let go until Chukwuemeka was upright again, back in his wheelchair, his face streaked with mud and rain. He wiped his eyes and looked at the person who had stopped. She was young, perhaps 23 or 24, with a round face that carried the kind of beauty that did not announce itself but simply existed. The way a sunrise exists, whether or not anyone is awake to see it. Her clothes were wet through, a faded Ankara blouse with a small tear at the shoulder, a wrapper tied firmly at the waist, and rubber slippers that had been repaired so many times the original color was impossible to guess. Her hands were calloused. Her nails were short, and her eyes large, dark brown, framed by lashes still heavy with raindrops, held a warmth that Chukwuemeka had not seen directed at him since his father's death. Her name was Adaiza. She sold rice porridge, a simple warm dish of soft-boiled rice with bits of smoked fish and a pinch of salt from a wooden cart near the Abakpa Junction every morning from 5 to 9. She earned between 800 and 1,200 naira a day. It was enough to pay for the single room she rented behind the church and to send a small amount to her younger brother, who was trying to finish secondary school in their village near Nsukka. She had no parents. They had died in a factory fire when she was 15. She had no husband. She had no savings. What she had was a stubbornness about kindness that most people would call foolish and that Chukwuemeka would come to call extraordinary. She gathered his scattered rice from the mud, grain by grain, filling the bag again, even though half of it was ruined. She wheeled him back to his apartment without being asked. She did not ask his name. She did not ask what had happened to his legs. She simply helped, the way rain falls without negotiation, without expectation, without keeping score. The next morning, Chukwemeka found a small clay pot sitting outside his door. Inside was porridge, still warm, with 2 pieces of smoked fish arranged neatly on top. There was no note, but he knew. He ate it slowly. It was the first meal in months that tasted like something more than survival. It tasted like someone had thought about him. Simple, but real. The morning after that, another pot appeared. And the morning after that, and the morning after that. On the 5th morning, Chukwemeka was waiting by his door when she arrived. He thanked her, and his voice cracked in a way that embarrassed him, because it had been so long since he had spoken to anyone with gratitude that the muscles in his throat had almost forgotten how. Adeze smiled and told him not to worry, that she always made too much porridge anyway and it would only go to waste if he did not eat it. This was a lie. She made exactly enough each day. The pot she brought to him was her own breakfast, but neither of them mentioned this. Some kindnesses are too delicate to survive the weight of acknowledgement. As the weeks went by, Adeze began to visit in the evenings as well. She would sit on the concrete step outside his door while he sat in his wheelchair just inside, and they would talk as the sun dropped behind the rooftops and the crickets began their nightly chorus. She told him about her parents, about the fire, about the years she spent sleeping in market stalls before she saved enough for a room. He told her about his father, about the accident, about the empire that had been stolen from him. He did not tell her the name Okafor. He did not tell her about the billions. He simply said he had lost everything, and she nodded as though she understood, because she did. Loss does not require explanation between people who have lived it. One evening, Chukwemeka showed her what he was building. He turned the cracked laptop screen toward her and explained the algorithms, the terrain mapping, the potential applications for people like him, people whose legs had failed them but whose minds had not. Adeze did not understand the code. She did not understand the engineering, but she understood the fire in his eyes, and that was enough. From that evening forward, she became his hands in the outside world. When he needed circuit boards and microcontrollers, she went to the electronics market in Ogbede and haggled with vendors who tried to charge her double because she was a woman. When he needed printed documents for patent applications, she traveled 40 minutes by bus to the business center in Independence Layout because it was the only one with a printer that worked. When the power went out for 3 consecutive days and Chukwemeka's laptop battery died completely, she carried it on her head, wrapped in a plastic bag against the rain, to a generator-powered cafe on Zik Avenue. All so he could save his work. She never asked for payment. He offered many times. She always refused. Meanwhile, in Lagos, Obiora sat in his father's leather chair on the 17th floor and congratulated himself on a problem well solved. The cripple was gone. The shares were secured. The empire was his. He did not think about Chukwemeka. He did not think about Enugu. He did not think about the fire that was growing, quietly, in a 2-room flat at the end of an unpaved road. But fate had other plans. Months passed, and the season changed. But Chukwemeka's determination did not waver. By the 9th month in Enugu, something remarkable happened. Working 18-hour days on a cracked laptop, powered by unreliable electricity, assisted by a woman who sold porridge for less than $1 a day, Chukwemeka Okafor completed the first functional prototype of his autonomous navigation system. He tested it on his own wheelchair. The system mapped his apartment, detected the cracked tiles, avoided the bathroom threshold, and navigated to the kitchen with a precision that made his hands tremble, not from exhaustion this time, but from something he had not felt in over a year: hope. He filed the patent application that night. International filing. United States, European Union, China, and the African Regional Intellectual Property Organization. The filing fee consumed the last of his savings and 2 months of Adeze's porridge earnings that she had insisted with a stubbornness that matched his own on contributing. Little did either of them know that this single filing would set in motion a chain of events that would shake the Okafor Empire to its foundations and bring 2 continents to their knees. But that reckoning was still months away. For now, there was only a small apartment in Enugu, a cracked laptop, a woman who sold porridge, and a man in a wheelchair who had just refused to stay down. News travels slowly through official channels in Nigeria, but it travels at the speed of light through whispers. And so it was that the whisper about Chukwuemeka Okafor reached Lagos, not through any corporate memo or board meeting, but through the careless gossip of a driver who had once worked for Chief Emmanuel, the crippled son, the discarded heir, the man who had been erased from the company directory. The driver told a gateman. The gateman told a cook. The cook told Madame Ifeoma's personal assistant. And the personal assistant, who had learned long ago that the fastest way to earn favor with Madame Ifeoma was to deliver bad news about other people, whispered it during a morning hair appointment. The cripple in Enugu was not wasting away as expected. He was building something. He had filed some kind of paper with an international office. And there was a girl, a common porridge seller, who was helping him. Madame Ifeoma set down her teacup with a precision that could cut glass. She did not raise her voice. She never raised her voice. That was what made her dangerous. Women who shout can be dismissed. Women who speak softly while their eyes turn to stone cannot. She picked up her phone and called Obiora, and the conversation that followed lasted exactly 4 minutes. When it ended, Obiora leaned back in his father's leather chair and stared at the ceiling for a long time. Then he booked a flight to Enugu. The first humiliation came on a market day. Chukwuemeka had wheeled himself to the Abakpa Junction to buy batteries for the prototype sensor module. The sun was brutal that afternoon, the kind of heat that turned the air into a visible shimmer above the red earth road and made the tin roofs of the market stalls tick and groan like living things. Sweat ran down his temples and pooled in the creases of his palms as he gripped the wheel rims. The market was crowded with women carrying basins of tomatoes on their heads, children darting between legs like small brown fish, and vendors shouting prices in a language that was half Igbo, half pure theater. Adaze was beside him, pushing his chair through a particularly congested section near the electronic stalls, when a black SUV with tinted windows pulled up at the edge of the market. The kind of vehicle that did not belong in Abakpa. The kind that made people stop and stare and wonder which big man had taken a wrong turn. Obiora stepped out. He was wearing a sky blue agbada that probably cost more than every stall in the market combined. And he moved through the crowd with the unhurried confidence of a man who believed the ground existed for the sole purpose of supporting his shoes. 2 bodyguards flanked him, their dark sunglasses reflecting the chaos of the market like twin screens showing a movie about poverty. Obiora found Chukwuemeka near the battery vendor's table. He stopped. He looked down at his brother, and the word down carried the full weight of its meaning. Because Obiora was standing, and Chukwuemeka was sitting, and between those two positions lay an entire philosophy about who mattered and who did not. Something about the way Obiora looked at the wheelchair, at the dusty wheels, at Chukwuemeka's sweat-soaked shirt, made the surrounding vendors grow quiet. Market women who had been haggling at the top of their lungs suddenly found reasons to lower their voices. Even the children stopped running. Obiora spoke, and his voice carried the casual cruelty of a man who had rehearsed his lines on the flight from Lagos. He said he had come to check on his little brother, to make sure the company's generosity was being put to good use. He looked around the market at the wooden stalls, at the open gutters, at the flies circling a pile of rotting plantains, and he said that this was exactly where Chukwuemeka belonged. That some people were born to build empires, and some people were born to sit in markets and watch empires being built by others. He said it loudly enough for 20 people to hear. He said it with a smile. Then his eyes moved to Adaze, who stood behind the wheelchair with her hands still on the push handles. And his smile widened in a way that was not a smile at all. He asked who this was, this girl in rubber slippers with fish scales under her fingernails. He asked if this was the great love story he had heard about, the cripple and the porridge seller. He laughed. One of the bodyguards laughed too, because bodyguards are paid to laugh when their employers laugh. Chukwuemeka said nothing. His jaw tightened. His hands gripped the wheel rims until the metal bit into his palms. But he said nothing, because he had learned in hospital beds and empty apartments and muddy roads that silence is sometimes the only weapon a man without legs can wield. Obiora left. The black SUV disappeared,
in a cloud of red dust, and the market slowly returned to its noise.
But the damage was done.
That evening, Chukwuemeka did not eat. A day's brought the porridge as usual, but it sat on the desk untouched, growing cold beside the laptop whose screen still glowed with half-finished code. She sat on the step outside and waited.
She did not knock. She did not ask if he was okay.
She simply waited, because she understood that some wounds need silence before they can accept comfort. Inside the apartment, in the darkness, Chukwuemeka sat in his wheelchair and stared at his legs. He thought about his father, about the strong hands that had gripped his own in the hospital, about the voice that had called him the heart of the empire. He thought about the marble floors of Okafor Holdings, about the sound his shoes used to make when he walked across that lobby, the confident click of leather on stone that he would never hear again. He thought about Obira's eyes, looking down, always looking down. And then he thought about a daisy, about the porridge,
about the hands that had pulled him from the mud, about the woman who gave away her breakfast every morning and pretended she had too much.
He reached for the laptop. He opened the code editor.
And he worked until 3 a.m, until his fingers ached and his vision blurred. Because the only way to answer humiliation is with creation. And the only way to answer cruelty is with excellence. What nobody could see was the quiet strength that held him together. The second humiliation came 6 weeks later, inside the walls of a hospital.
Chukwuemeka's spine required periodic treatment, nerve block injections to manage the chronic pain that radiated from his lower back down through his dead legs like electricity searching for a ground that no longer existed. Without these injections, the pain would escalate from manageable to unbearable within weeks, turning every waking hour into an exercise in endurance. His neurologist at Enugu Teaching Hospital had been administering the treatments every 2 months, covered by the company health insurance that had been part of Chukwuemeka's severance arrangement. Until it wasn't. The letter arrived on a Monday, typed on Okafor Holdings' letterhead, signed by the head of human resources, a man Chukwuemeka had never met, appointed by Obiora 3 months after the board vote. The letter stated, in language so polite it could have been mistaken for kindness, that Chukwuemeka's medical coverage had been reviewed and deemed inconsistent with current company policy for inactive personnel.
Effective immediately, all medical benefits were terminated.
Chukwuemeka read the letter twice. Then he folded it carefully, placed it on his desk beside the laptop, and sat in silence for a very long time.
The hospital bill for a single nerve block session was 85,000 naira. His monthly stipend was 150,000. Rent was 60,000. Food and transport consumed the rest. There was nothing left. There had never been anything left. He did not tell Adeze. He could not tell her, because he knew what she would do. And he was right to be afraid. Because somehow, through the invisible network of care that connected her to his suffering the way roots connect to water, she found out anyway.
She came to his apartment the next evening carrying a small cloth pouch. Inside the pouch was a gold bangle. It was thin, scratched, and the clasp was held together with a piece of wire.
It was the only piece of jewelry she owned. Her mother had been wearing it the day she died in the factory fire, and the hospital had returned it along with the body. Adeze had carried it for 9 years, through every hardship, through every hungry night, through every market day when she could have sold it for enough money to eat well for a month. She had never sold it, because it was the last thing her mother had touched. She placed it on Chukwuemeka's desk, beside the termination letter, and told him to sell it for the hospital bill.
Her voice was steady, but her hand trembled when she pulled it away from the bangle, and that tremor contained more courage than any speech Chukwuemeka had ever heard in any boardroom in Lagos.
He tried to refuse. He told her he could not accept this. He told her the bangle was worth more than any injection. He told her that her mother's memory was more important than his pain. But Adeze looked at him, looked straight into his eyes with a directness that left no room for argument, and said that her mother would have done the same thing. That her mother had taught her that gold is just metal, but a life saved is gold that cannot be measured. The words hit him like a stone dropped into still water. He sold the bangle the next day for 62,000 naira. It was not enough for the full treatment. But the neurologist, a woman named Dr. Obiageli, who had treated Chukwuemeka since the accident and who understood that medicine is not always about money, agreed to perform the injection and let him pay the remainder when he could. But the hospital visit brought a new humiliation that neither of them had anticipated. Madame Ifeoma, who monitored her stepson's movements with the vigilance of a woman who understood that the only thing more dangerous than a defeated enemy is an enemy who refuses to accept defeat, had received word that Chukwuemeka was still seeking treatment. She called the hospital directly, not Chukwuemeka, not the doctor. She called Adaeze. How she obtained Adaeze's phone number remains unclear. What is clear is the message she delivered. Her voice came through the phone speaker like cold water poured on a sleeping child, sharp, sudden, and designed to shock. She told Adaeze that she was a nobody, a porridge seller with dirt under her fingernails and delusions above her station. She asked what Adaeze thought she was doing, attaching herself to a cripple from a family that had already discarded him. She said the Okafor name was not a charity ward for village girls with romantic fantasies. She told Adaeze to leave Chukwuemeka alone, to go back to her cart and her fish and her rubber slippers, and to stop embarrassing herself by pretending she belonged in a world that would never accept her. Adaeze listened to every word. She did not interrupt. She did not cry. When Madame Ifeoma finished, Adaeze said only one thing, that she was sorry. Madame felt that way. Then she ended the call. She sat on the concrete step outside Chukwuemeka's apartment for a long time that evening. The sun had already set. The crickets had started. The air smelled of rain that had not yet arrived. Inside, Chukwuemeka was working on the code, unaware of the call. Adaeze's mind moved through the words Madame Ifeoma had spoken, turning them over the way one turns over a stone to see what lives beneath it. She thought about her mother, about the factory fire, about the years she had spent invisible at the market, invisible at the church, invisible to every man who had ever looked past her, because she did not wear gold, or drive a car, or carry a handbag with a foreign name on it. She had learned to take up as little space as possible. She had learned that being unseen was safer than being seen and found lacking. But Chukwuemeka had seen her, truly seen her, not as a porridge seller, not as a charity case, not as a pair of hands to push his wheelchair. He had shown her his code, his dreams, his fears. He had trusted her with the most vulnerable version of himself. And that trust, quiet, unremarkable, offered without ceremony, was worth more than every gold bangle in every market in Nigeria. She decided, sitting on that step, that she would not leave. Not because she was stubborn, although she was. Not because she pitied him, because she did not. She decided to stay because for the first time in her life, someone had seen her, truly seen her, and she was not willing to become invisible again. Little did Madame Ifeoma know that the woman she had just insulted would one day sit at the head of a table where Madame Ifeoma would not even be allowed through the door. The third humiliation, the ultimate one, the one that was designed to break what could not be broken, came on the night of Okafor Holdings' 30th anniversary gala. The invitation arrived at Chukwuemeka's apartment in Enugu inside a cream-colored envelope embossed with gold lettering. His name was printed in elegant calligraphy, Mr. Chukwuemeka Okafor. The card inside requested his presence at the grand ballroom of the Eco Hotel in Victoria Island, Lagos, for an evening of celebration honoring the legacy of Chief Emmanuel Okafor and the continued success of Okafor Holdings under new leadership. Chukwuemeka held the invitation and felt something cold move through his stomach. He knew Obiora. He knew this was not generosity. This was theater. But he also knew that refusing would be interpreted as weakness. And weakness was a currency he could no longer afford to spend. He went, and Adaeze went with him. They flew into Lagos on a commercial flight economy class, the cheapest tickets available. Adaeze had never been on an airplane. She sat by the window and watched the clouds with wide eyes and did not speak for the first 20 minutes because the beauty of the sky from above had stolen her words. Chukwuemeka watched her, watching the clouds, and something inside his chest expanded in a way that had nothing to do with altitude. The Eco Hotel ballroom was a cathedral of excess. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars hung from a ceiling painted with gold leaf. Round tables draped in white silk held centerpieces of imported orchids and tall candles whose flames danced in the air-conditioned breeze. 500 guests filled the room, politicians, CEOs, diplomats, socialites, and the particular species of wealthy Lagosian who attended every gala not for the cause but for the opportunity to be photographed beside other wealthy Lagosians. The men wore custom-tailored agbadas and three-piece suits. The women wore aso-oke so elaborately woven it could have been mistaken for architecture. The air smelled of French perfume, grilled lobster, and money. Chukwuemeka arrived in his wheelchair, wearing the one good shirt he still owned, a white button-down that Adias had ironed that morning with a borrowed iron. Ades wore a simple green dress she had sewn herself from fabric bought at Ogbete Market. No jewelry, no makeup, no handbag. They entered through the main doors, because there was no wheelchair ramp at the VIP entrance, and a bellboy had to help lift the wheelchair over a 2-inch threshold, while a queue of guests in evening wear watched and whispered. The room noticed them the way a body notices a splinter, with a small, irritated awareness that something did not belong. Obiora was magnificent. He stood at the center of the room in a midnight blue agbada with silver embroidery that caught the chandelier light and scattered it like stars. His smile was wide and practiced. His handshake was firm. He moved through the crowd, distributing charm with the efficiency of a man who had been bred for performance. Madame Ifioma sat at the head table in a crimson wrapper set and enough gold to anchor a small boat, receiving compliments the way a queen receives tribute, with a nod that acknowledged the offering without suggesting equality. Chukwuemeka and Adias were seated at table 19, the back of the room, near the kitchen doors, the table closest to the exit and farthest from the stage. They shared the table with 3 junior staff members who spent the evening looking at their phones. There was also a retired secretary who had worked for Chief Emmanuel in the early days. She recognized Chukwuemeka with a gasp that she quickly covered with her napkin. For 2 hours, Chukwuemeka sat in his wheelchair at table 19 and watched his brother accept praise for an empire their father had built and that Chukwuemeka had been born to lead. He watched the projection screen display photographs of Chief Emmanuel, photographs that included a young Chukwuemeka standing beside his father at a groundbreaking ceremony, photographs that had been carefully edited to remove Chukwuemeka's face and replace it with Obiora's. He watched and he said nothing. Then the speeches began. Obiora took the stage. The applause was generous. The spotlight made his agbada glow. He spoke about legacy, about vision, about the Okafor name as a symbol of Nigerian excellence. He spoke about his father's courage and his own commitment to carrying the torch forward. And then, with a gesture that appeared spontaneous but had clearly been choreographed, he turned toward the back of the room. He invited his dear brother, Chukwuemeka, to stand. Then he caught himself, with a small, theatrical pause. Or rather, he corrected to be acknowledged, as proof that the Okafor family remained united in its devotion to their father's dream. A spotlight swung to table 19. 500 pairs of eyes followed it. Chukwuemeka sat in his wheelchair, blinded by the white light. His white shirt suddenly too bright. His wheelchair suddenly too visible. The kitchen doors behind him suddenly too close. The audience clapped politely, the way people clap for things they do not understand but feel obligated to acknowledge. Some of them craned their necks to see. Others whispered behind champagne flutes. A photographer took a picture. Obiora continued. He spoke about resilience and about the importance of family and about how sometimes life gives us challenges that test our character. He said that his brother was a testament to the Okafor spirit, a man who, despite his limitations, had found peace in a quieter life outside the demands of corporate leadership. The word limitations hung in the air like smoke. The word peace was a blade disguised as a flower. And then Madame Ifioma rose from the head table and walked slowly, deliberately, with the imperial posture of a woman who has never been refused anything toward table 19. She reached Adeze, who was sitting beside Chukwuemeka with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight, and her green homemade dress surrounded by a sea of silk and aso-oke. Madame Ifioma looked at Adeze. She looked at the dress. She looked at the rubber slippers that peeked out from beneath the tablecloth. Then she turned to the nearest security guard. She said it loudly enough for the surrounding tables to hear. She said that this woman was not on the guest list, that she did not meet the dress code requirements for the event, and that she should be escorted out immediately, so as not to cause embarrassment to the Okafor family. The security guard hesitated. He looked at Adeze. He looked at Madame Ifioma. He looked at Chukwuemeka. And then he reached for Adeze's arm. Adeze did not resist. She stood. She smoothed her green dress with both hands, a gesture so small and so dignified it contained more grace than everything else in that ballroom combined. She looked at Chukwuemeka, and in her eyes, there was no anger, no shame, no plea for rescue. There was only a quiet steadiness, as though she had always known this moment would come and had already decided how she would carry it. She walked out. The kitchen doors swung shut behind her, and Chukwuemeka was left alone at table 19, surrounded by 500 strangers, his wheelchair casting a long shadow across the white tablecloth in the chandelier light. The applause for Obiora's speech resumed. The music started, the waiters circulated with champagne, and the evening continued as though nothing had happened. Because in rooms like this, nothing ever happened to people who didn't matter. Chukwuemeka sat still for a very long time. His hands rested on his dead legs. His face showed nothing. But behind his eyes, in the space where his father's voice still echoed, a door was closing. Not the door to grief. Not the door to self-pity. The door to patience. He remembered his father's words, the words from the hospital bed. The words spoken in a voice roughened by age and sadness. His father had told him he was the heart of the empire, that he should never let anyone take that from him. Never. A lump formed in his throat, but he swallowed it. He had swallowed so many lumps in the past year that his throat had become an expert at making pain disappear. He found Adeze outside the hotel, sitting on a low wall near the parking lot, watching the ocean. The Lagos night was warm and thick with salt air. The sound of waves mixed with the distant bass of the gala's music. She was not crying. She was simply sitting the way people sit when they have been reminded of their place in the world and are deciding whether to accept it. And Chukwuemeka wheeled himself beside her. They sat together in silence for several minutes. Then he took her hand, her calloused hand, her strong, small, extraordinary hand, and he held it with everything he had. He told her, in a voice so quiet the ocean almost swallowed it, that he was sorry, that she deserved better than this, that she deserved better than him, a man in a wheelchair who could not protect her from the cruelty of people who measured human worth in fabric and gold. Adeze looked at him. She did not smile. She said that he was the only person who had ever seen her, and that being seen by one person was worth more than being admired by 500. She said that gold tarnishes and silk tears, but the way he looked at her when she brought him porridge in the morning, that look did not tarnish. That look did not tear. The words left her lips so softly, yet they echoed loudly in his mind. There was no taking them back now, and he did not want to. They returned to Enugu the next morning. Economy class, window seat. Adeze watched the clouds again, but this time she did not smile. What happened next would change everything. Chukwuemeka opened his laptop on the flight. In his inbox, buried beneath spam and promotional emails from a world that had forgotten he existed, sat a message that had arrived at 3:47 a.m. while he had been sitting in a ballroom being humiliated by his own blood. The subject line read, "Patent application status update approved." He clicked it. He read it. He read it again. The International Patent Office had approved his autonomous navigation system across all 4 filing territories. And attached to the approval notice were 3 separate emails from Meridian Technologies in San Francisco, from Nexus Mobility in Berlin, and from Kailong Automotive Group in Shenzhen, each expressing interest in licensing the technology. Each email contained a number. The numbers had many zeros. Chukwuemeka closed the laptop. He looked at Adeze, who was watching the clouds. He did not tell her. Not yet. Because the fire that had been burning underground for over a year had just broken the surface, and he needed a moment, just one quiet moment to feel its heat before he let it consume the world. Little did Obiora know that every humiliation he had piled upon his brother was another brick in the empire that would one day crush him. 18 months passed. 18 months that, for the rest of the world, were silent. But for Chukwuemeka Okafor, they were the loudest months of his life. The licensing deals came first. Meridian Technologies signed within 6 weeks of the patent approval, followed by Nexus Mobility in Berlin, and 3 months later, Kailong Automotive Group in Shenzhen. The fees were substantial. Not billions. Not yet. But enough to incorporate Kinetic Frontier Labs as a proper entity. Enough to hire a small team of engineers in Enugu. Enough to lease a modest office space in Independence Layout. And enough! This was the part Chukwuemeka had circled in red ink on a napkin the night he received the first wire transfer to fly to Seoul. The Samsung Medical Center in Gangnam-gu had a spinal rehabilitation unit that was considered, by those who knew such things, to be the finest on earth. Dr. Park Jun-ho, the lead neurosurgeon, had pioneered a procedure involving epidural electrical stimulation combined with intensive physical therapy that had, in a small number of cases, restored partial motor function to patients with incomplete spinal cord injuries. The success rate was low. The process was agonizing. The timeline was 14 months of daily sessions, each one lasting 4 to 6 hours, each one demanding that Chukwuemeka's body relearn movements it had forgotten how to perform. There were days when the pain was so severe that he vomited on the therapy mat. There were weeks when his legs refused to respond and the therapist exchanged glances they thought he could not see. There were nights when he lay in his hospital bed in Seoul and wondered if the 5% his father's surgeon had spoken of was a number or a prayer. But Chukwuemeka had been trained by suffering. He had coded through power outages. He had eaten porridge meant for someone else's breakfast. He had sat in a ballroom while 500 people looked at him as though he were furniture. Pain was not new to him. Pain was an old companion, and he had learned, long ago, that the only way to defeat it was to outlast it. By the 11th month, he took his first step. It was not graceful. It was not dramatic. His left foot moved forward approximately 15 centimeters, and then his right knee buckled, and 2 therapists caught him before he hit the floor. But it was a step. And Chukwuemeka, who had not cried since the day his father died, wept. By the 14th month, he could walk, slowly, with a slight stiffness in his left hip that the doctor said might never fully resolve. But he could walk, he could stand, he could enter a room on his own 2 feet and leave it the same way. He told no one. Not the press, not the board, not even a daze, who had remained in Enugu managing the porridge cart and, increasingly, the administrative side of Kinetic Frontier Labs with a competence that surprised everyone except Chukwuemeka. He communicated with her by phone and video call, always seated, always framed from the chest up. She did not know about the surgery. She did not know about the steps. She knew only that he was abroad for business, that the company was growing, and that he missed her porridge every morning. He was saving the truth for the right moment. And the right moment, he decided, would be the moment when the people who had broken him were forced to watch him stand. Meanwhile, in Lagos, Obiora's kingdom was crumbling. 18 months, during which the name Chukwuemeka Okafor disappeared entirely from Lagos conversation, replaced by the louder, shinier noise of Obiora's reign. Okafor Holdings expanded into telecommunications, acquired a struggling airline, and broke ground on a luxury resort in Calabar that the newspapers called visionary and the accountants called reckless. Obiora's face appeared on the covers of Business Day and This Day Style. His engagement to the daughter of a former state governor was announced with a party that shut down 3 streets in Ikoyi. Madame Ifioma redecorated the family estate in Banana Island with Italian furniture flown in by cargo jet. Everything was golden. Everything was rising. Except the numbers. Behind the magazine covers and champagne toasts, Okafor Holdings was bleeding. The airline acquisition had consumed 400 million naira more than projected. The Calabar resort was 18 months behind schedule. 3 major clients had quietly moved their shipping contracts to competitors. The investment portfolio, which Chief Emmanuel had built with the patience of a man who understood that wealth is a slow river, had been raided by Obiora to fund projects designed more for headlines than for profit. The board members who had voted 11-3 to remove Chukwuemeka were now holding emergency meetings behind closed doors, and the word restructuring was being whispered in corridors where it had never been whispered before.
Obiora needed a miracle. And miracles, in the corporate world, come dressed as partnerships. The news reached him through his head of strategy, a company called Kinetic Frontier Labs, a mobility technology firm that had emerged from nowhere in the past year, held the patents to an autonomous navigation system. Every major automotive manufacturer on 3 continents wanted it. Tesla had made an offer. Hyundai had made a higher offer. Kailong Automotive in Shenzhen had offered the highest of all. But Kinetic Frontier Labs had declined every acquisition bid and instead announced it was seeking a strategic manufacturing and distribution partner in Africa, a partner with infrastructure, a partner with logistics networks, a partner with the kind of continental footprint that only a company like Okafor Holdings possessed. Obiora saw salvation. He saw his name on another magazine cover. He saw the board silenced and the debts erased and his father's empire not just saved but catapulted into the technology sector. He instructed his legal team to prepare the most aggressive partnership proposal in the company's history. He flew to Abuja to secure government facilitation. He called in every favor he had accumulated in 3 years of power. The deal was set. The signing ceremony would take place at the Okafor Holdings Boardroom on Victoria Island. Kinetic Frontier Labs would send its CEO and legal team. The press would be invited. The moment would be historic. Obiora did not bother to research the CEO of Kinetic Frontier Labs. He knew the company was registered in Enugu. He knew it was small. He assumed the CEO would be some provincial engineer, grateful and awed, easy to dominate in negotiations. He did not read the full filing documents. He did not check the inventor's name on the patent. If he had, the story might have ended differently. The boardroom of Okafor Holdings occupied the entire 17th floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Lagos Lagoon. The mahogany conference table could seat 30. Chief Emmanuel's portrait hung on the far wall, oil on canvas, commissioned in 2015, showing the old man in his favorite gray agbada with his walking stick resting against the frame. His eyes, even in paint, seemed to be watching. On the morning of the signing, Obiora arrived early. He wore a charcoal black 3-piece suit tailored in London. His cufflinks were gold. His shoes were polished to a mirror finish. Madame Ifioma sat at the far end of the table in a lavender lace ensemble, her presence less about business and more about ownership, a reminder to everyone in the room that the Okafor throne had a queen. The press filled the back of the room. Camera flashes, microphone booms. Journalists from Channels TV, Arise News, and 4 international wire services. The board members sat along both sides of the table, their faces carrying the controlled optimism of men who knew the company was drowning and hoped this partnership was the lifeboat. At exactly 10 o'clock, the boardroom doors opened. A team entered first. 4 lawyers in dark suits, 2 women and 2 men, carrying leather briefcases and tablet computers, moving with the coordinated efficiency of people who were paid by the hour and never wasted a second. They took their seats on the opposite side of the table without greeting anyone, arranging documents with a silence that was itself a form of power. Then nothing happened. For 30 seconds, the doorway was empty. The room waited. Obiora checked his watch. The cameras continued to flash at the empty door. Someone coughed, and then he walked in. Not wheeled, walked. Chukwuemeka Okafor stepped through the doorway of his father's boardroom on 2 legs. His stride was slow, deliberate, not hesitant. The walk of a man who had earned every single step through 14 months of agony in a soul rehabilitation ward and who was now spending those steps on the only stage that mattered. He wore a black 3-piece suit. No embroidery, no gold, no flourish, just black. Cut with the precision of a man who did not need decoration because he was the decoration. His shoulders were straight. His chin was level. His eyes, the same eyes that had stared at hospital ceilings and muddy roads in Table 19, were calm, absolutely calm. The calm of a man who had already won and was simply arriving to collect. He stopped at the head of the table, his father's end, directly beneath the portrait. Obiora looked up. The color drained from his face. Not slowly,
Not gradually. It vanished, the way light vanishes when a switch is thrown. His mouth opened. No sound came out. His hands, which had been resting confidently on a stack of partnership documents, went still, completely still. The way a man's hands go still when his body understands something his mind has not yet processed. Madame Ifeoma's teacup hit the saucer with a sound like a small bone breaking. Her eyes widened, her lips parted. The lavender lace around her shoulders suddenly looked less like elegance and more like a shroud. The board members turned, one by one, like dominoes falling in slow motion. The retired chairman, a man who had known Chief Emmanuel for 30 years, removed his glasses and put them back on, as though the problem might be optical. The head of strategy, who had arranged the entire partnership, looked from Chukwuemeka to Obiora and back again. And his face performed the particular kind of mathematics that occurs when a man realizes he has built a bridge directly to his employer's executioner. The journalists understood first. They always do. The cameras erupted. Flash after flash after flash, turning the boardroom into a strobe-lit stage. Chukwuemeka did not sit. He stood. He let them look. Then he spoke. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. The room was already silent enough to hear the lagoon water lapping against the building's foundation 17 floors below. He said his name, Chukwuemeka Okafor. He said his title, Chief Executive Officer, Kinetic Frontier Labs. He said the company's valuation as of that morning's pre-market assessment, $1.7 billion. He let the numbers sit in the air. He let it breathe. Then he said that before any documents were signed, there was a matter of corporate governance that required immediate attention. He nodded to his lead attorney, a woman named Barrister Okonkwo, who rose and placed a file on the table with the quiet authority of someone delivering a verdict. The file contained the original medical documents that had been used to declare Chukwuemeka mentally unfit. Beside them were affidavits from the 2 doctors who had signed those documents. Both doctors had agreed to testify that the documents were fraudulent. Their cooperation had been secured by forensic accountants who had traced the anonymous donations to their medical practices directly back to Madame Ifeoma's personal bank account. The file also contained Chukwuemeka's original share certificates, the authentic will of Chief Emmanuel Okafor, and a formal complaint filed with the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission. Chukwuemeka looked at Obiora. Obiora's chair creaked. His mouth moved. No words. Chukwuemeka spoke again. Short sentences. Each one a nail. He said that the partnership with Okafor Holdings was contingent on the immediate removal of Obiora Okafor from all executive positions. He said that the EFCC had already opened an investigation into corporate fraud, forgery, and misappropriation of inheritance. He said that the board had a choice: cooperate with the restructuring or face individual liability for their complicity in the illegal removal of a rightful shareholder. Obiora stood. His chair scraped against the marble floor. The sound was ugly. He tried to speak. His voice broke on the first syllable, cracked on the second, and by the third he was not speaking at all but pleading a raw, unstructured noise that had no place in a boardroom and every place in a confession. He said Chukwuemeka's name. He said the word brother. He said the word sorry. He said them in the wrong order and repeated them in a different wrong order, and each repetition made the word smaller and more meaningless, the way a coin loses its value when you discover it is made of tin. Madame Ifeoma did not stand. She did not speak. She sat perfectly still in her lavender lace, and her face performed no expression at all, which was the most terrifying expression of all, because it meant she had already calculated the loss and was now calculating the escape. There would be no escape. 2 EFCC officers entered the boardroom through a side door that Chukwuemeka's legal team had arranged to have unlocked 30 minutes before the meeting. They carried warrants. They were polite, because the law is always polite when it is certain. Obiora was asked to accompany them. Madame Ifeoma was asked to accompany them. Their assets, the Banana Island estate, the fleet of vehicles, the offshore accounts in Dubai and the Cayman Islands were frozen as of 9 o'clock that morning, 1 hour before Chukwuemeka had walked through the door. Obiora turned to his brother one last time. His eyes were wet. His jaw was trembling. He looked nothing like the man in the sky-blue agbada who had stood in the Abakba market and told his crippled brother that this was where he belonged. Chukwemeka looked back at him. He did not smile. He did not gloat. He said one sentence, and it was the last thing Obiora heard before the officers led him out of the room. He said, "You never asked me where it hurt. You only asked me how many shares I had." The boardroom doors closed. The cameras kept flashing, and Chukwemeka Okafor stood beneath his father's portrait, on his own two legs, in the building his father had built, and he breathed.
In the weeks that followed, the world rearranged itself around the truth the way water rearranges itself around a stone.
Okafor Holdings was restructured. Chukwuemeka's 60% shareholding was restored in full. The fraudulent trust documents were annulled by a high court order that took less than 48 hours to process. This speed surprised no one. Judges, like everyone else, move quickly when the evidence is undeniable and the cameras are watching. Kinetic Frontier Labs merged with Okafor Holdings' logistics and manufacturing division, creating a new entity that the Financial Times would later describe as the most significant African technology partnership of the decade. The autonomous navigation system entered mass production within 6 months, deployed first in mobility devices across West Africa, then in commercial vehicles, then in autonomous delivery systems that would reshape the continent's supply chain infrastructure. Chukwuemeka did not move back into the Banana Island estate. He sold it. He used the proceeds to build a rehabilitation center in Enugu, a state-of-the-art facility specializing in spinal cord injuries, staffed by the same Korean surgical team that had helped him walk again. The center offered free treatment to patients who could not afford it. He named it the Emmanuel Okafor Center for Recovery. His father's portrait hung in the lobby. Mama Nkechi, the elderly neighbor in Abakba who had watched over Chukwuemeka during the darkest months, was not forgotten. The woman who had brought him water during power outages, who had chased away the children who threw stones at his window, was given a fully furnished apartment in the new Okafor residential complex in Independence layout. She was also given a monthly pension that would last the rest of her life. When she was told the news, she sat down on her plastic chair and wept, not because she was surprised by the generosity, but because she had always believed it would come. She had told Chukwuemeka once, during a power outage, that God does not forget the people who carry water for others. She had been right. And that days, on a warm evening in March, on the rooftop terrace of the new Kinetic Frontier Labs headquarters in Victoria Island, Chukwuemeka took her hand. It was the same building where she had once been escorted out by a security guard for wearing rubber slippers. The Lagos skyline stretched out behind them like a promise. The lagoon reflected the last light of the sun in bands of gold and copper. The air smelled of salt and jasmine. He did not kneel, because his legs, though healed enough to walk, could not yet bear that particular angle without pain. So he stood before her and held both of her hands and told her that he had built an empire, that he had reclaimed his name, that he had stood in his father's boardroom and faced the people who had broken him. But none of it, not the patents, not the billions, not the headlines, none of it meant anything without her. He told her that she had fed him when he was hungry, lifted him when he had fallen, and stayed when the entire world had told her to leave. He told her that he did not have a ring yet, because he wanted her to choose it herself. Because she had spent her entire life receiving whatever was left over, and he wanted her, for once, to choose first. Adace looked at him. She did not speak for a long time. The wind moved through her hair. Her eyes, those large, dark brown eyes that had once watched him from behind a wheelchair in the rain, filled with tears that she did not wipe away, because some tears are not weakness. Some tears are the body's way of saying yes before the mouth can form the word. She said yes. This story teaches us that a man's worth is not measured by whether he can stand, but by whether he refuses to stay down. True strength is not carried in the legs, it is carried in the will. And true wealth is not counted in shares or buildings or patents. It is counted in the people who stay beside you when you have nothing, who feed you from their own plate, who see you when the world has decided you are invisible. The universe does not forget kindness. It does not ignore sacrifice. It keeps a ledger that no accountant can audit, and when the time comes, it pays its debts in full. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, And subscribe so you do not miss more powerful stories like this one. What did you think of Chukwuemeka's journey? What lessons can we take from his story? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this story powerful and meaningful, share it with your friends and family to spread the wisdom and lessons of traditional African storytelling.